Hello and welcome to Comedy in a Nutshell, the podcast where we ask the people in comedy about their life and experience and how they would sum up comedy in a nutshell. For some, the answer to that question is a word. For others, it's a phrase or paragraph. And for some, the answer warrants a podcast episode all its own. But whichever it is, the answer is always different for everyone. Maybe that is the answer. I'm the comedy nerd who's seen more than 1,800 different comedians perform live comedy, and you can find out more about my journey in comedy fandom on my website, thecomedynerd.com. Please also take a moment to like, subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. Thank you. My guest this episode has many years' experience on the circuit around the UK and around the world, both as an MC and as a solo performer. They're also an experienced writer for TV and radio shows, including 8 out of 10 Cats and The News Quiz. It's comedian Juliet Meyers. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Mm-hmm. What's your earliest memory of comedy as an inspiration to you? How did it enter into your life? Do you remember?
I think it entered in. This is so weird. I always think about this T-shirt that my brother had that had a dodo on it, mm-hmm. and it said, "I'm extinct." And I thought that was hilarious. And it was made even more sort of delicious, I think, because it was just a T-shirt. Mm. But when I got it as a hand-me-down, my mum and my dad were like, "Oh, that stupid T-shirt." And I remember thinking, can't you tell that that's funny? And I think that comedy, like, it's very difficult to explain one's own childhood. But my dad was quite a odd man. He'd grown up, he was Iraqi, he grew up in India, he came to the UK, he was never very happy. And my mum was sort of in a bonkers world of her own. So comedy was this sort of absolute joy of, oh my God, I found where I belong. But I mean, I think in terms of, you know, so I don't know why I always think of that T-shirt, but I suppose because it just epitomized, like, I like this and you two are humorless. Or because I was racking my brains yesterday, they told jokes that were just not just off cut. My mum didn't tell jokes. My mum never got jokes. But my dad, like, I was thinking, was this appropriate? That, like, the first joke he would constantly say to me and my brother, I was about 4 or something, and my brother would have been 10. Yeah. Was about enemas. And you go, what? Well, George has to know what an enema is. So I think I just thought, this is a mad by the way, the punchline was, "Are you friend or enema?"
Of course.
But like, so I think suddenly seeing comedy on the telly, you know, like Morecambe and Wise or cartoons, but I think specifically adult comedy, I'm thinking, I get it. Like, even if I wasn't expected to get it. Right. There was something quite nice about going, I know what you've done. And I like that you've been a bit subversive or silly. That's interesting because a kid came to one of my shows a few years ago and came up to me afterwards and went, "I understood all of that." And there was something so nice about, I think you underestimate that kids are sponges and get it and are just absolutely up for it. And I think then, you know, all the Rowan Atkinsons, but there was a programme on, my dad was quite shouty. Right. And my mum let him be shouty. And I remember there was always a programme on Saturday sort of lunchtime that I'd listen to in my room on the radio that I want to say it was Steve Wright, but I don't know if it was, but they'd play comedy clips. Right. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was the best thing in the world, really. You know, I just couldn't have, I just loved it, really, you know, and it was an escape to, where are these people? I want to see these people rather than the kind of odd people of Putney or...
What was the road into comedy for you yourself then, to becoming a comedian?
Well, I mean, all the cliches, class clown, you know, impressions of the teachers. office clown, which now I look back and go on, I think that just means arsehole. But, I just couldn't help it. And then I guess the pivotal moment was there was an education college in Holborn, the City Lit, and everyone was enrolling to do yoga at lunchtime. And that's what I was going to do. Yeah. But they said, sorry, we're full up. And some woman gave me a brochure. And I was looking through it. And I said to someone in the office, I want to do something. And I said, oh, God, there's stand-up comedy for beginners. Who does that? And it was such a stupid loaded question. And thankfully, this person said, you. And I think I was very nervous, but I did it.
Right.
And I enjoyed writing it. And then when it came to actually, once we got in the advanced class, she was like, oh, you're going to have to do a showcase.
Yeah.
And I thought, I don't actually want to do it. I'm just enjoying thinking about it. But I think by then I was in a bit too deep of, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try it. And I did. I mean, it's awful. It's funny because I looked at your questions and I almost had like hideous flashbacks. like my first gig. I think already, I think I was good at writing the material talking about what drove me nuts and being, silly little subversive plans and stuff. But then I think when it came to editing it down, I think I probably didn't feel comfortable because it had all been sort of shrunk back to punchlines. And I remember we didn't have to do the showcase, but I felt I had to. And I was so nervous when it came to actually going on stage. I mean, I was nervous all day. I nearly fell off my bike and I hoped I'd die because that way I wouldn't have to do the gig. We had to invite friends to our first gig to sort of bump up the audience. And I remember them being sort of supportive, but sort of skeptical. And I hadn't really wanted to tell them that I was doing it yet. And I remember before the gig, I glanced at them all laughing with each other in the bar, having a good time without having seen me on stage. And I thought, oh, I hate you. And I did the gig and I was so nervous. It hasn't happened since and I still don't understand how it happened. But I was so nervous my bum cheeks sort of trembled of their own accords. And one of them, it felt like, it reminded me actually, because another one of my comedy heroes, one of the things that used to make me laugh so much growing up was all the Kenny Everett.
Yes.
The Rod Stewart thing when his bum just got bigger and bigger and bigger and all of that. And I felt like that's what my bum was doing on stage and that no one was listening to me because they were just going, what's her bum doing? And I think my friends laughed. It was supportive of them, bless them. But, I said, I'm from London. And one of them went, and you go, oh, you patronised. And I had a day job. So I think I didn't, I think I kept going, but I didn't feel I was part of the inner wheel for a long time. Right. I actually feel a bit like that now, but maybe that is part of being a comedian, that you never feel you fully belong, and maybe you shouldn't. But I didn't do enough gigs. I didn't seem to get any of the memos about where the gigs were, what you were supposed to be doing, really. And it's weird because in a way, when I look back at some of the jokes I used to do, although they were terrible because they were so new, I think I didn't know the comedy rules. Right. And as awful as that was, there was something quite nicely optimistic or creative about just walking in and being an idiot rather than then people saying, oh, no, it's better if you laugh at, Americans, or it's better if you make a sexual joke, or, I could see people doing that. Whereas, I cringed, but, I had bits about Prince Charles or Jammy Dodgers. And it didn't quite work.
Right.
Always, but sometimes it did.
Yeah. Did you find that there was a point at which you considered yourself a comedian? This is who I am. This is the role that I am.
It's interesting. I think it took me quite a long time. Like sometimes I'd be with someone and they'd say, "Oh, we're comedians," and I'd think, "Are we?" Or I remember Josie Long. I remember bumping into Josie Long, who I absolutely thought was brilliant. And I remember I saw her just before she did her first Edinburgh show.
Right.
And she said something like, "Oh, we're comedians now. We're doing our first Edinburgh," or something. But I suppose it was that moment of, you suddenly see yourself larking about on stage, or I got made redundant from my day job, and it meant that I had to focus a lot more on I didn't have to, but I wanted to focus a lot more on comedy. I think it just happens. I think, sometimes people would introduce me and say, "Juliet's a comedian." And I'd think, "Oh my God," and then one day you realise you've wandered so far from the shore that you've gone feral. Or you say, I was walking along the road with a comedian after a gig, and or maybe it was at the gig, someone came up and told us something quite traumatic, and the comedian just saw it as a wordplay to say something awful.
Right.
And I thought, "You're an idiot, but you're constantly looking for ins into saying funny things."
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a very woolly answer to when did I become a comedian. But I suppose it just, like some people say it, I notice, after they've done their first gig. And I think, "Oh, get over yourself." I briefly went out with this idiot and I met his friends after work, and they said to me, this really just shows who decides who's a comedian, who isn't. I think it comes down to low self-esteem, but maybe I didn't say it for a long time. But I met this guy's friends after work. Yeah. And this guy said to me, what do you do?" Because they all worked in the city. Yeah. And I said, "I'm a comedian." And this guy went, oh, well, we're all comedians. And I thought, wow, like you haven't even been on stage and you're going, "Oh, we're all funny, we're all comedians." And I'm going, "No, I earn money and I travel up and down the country and this is all I do." So,
Yeah. Did being a comedian hold any surprises for you? Did it meet up with the expectations you had going in? Did you have any expectations?
No. Yes and no. I don't know if I did. I don't think I did have many expectations, because I think whereas I think, I look at a lot of people starting today, and maybe some of the people I started with, they were like, "Right, this is what I'm going to do." I remember someone saying to me, "Do you have a 5-year plan?" And I was like, "No." And they went, "What?" And they were like, "Do Edinburgh, get on the telly, bring out a DVD." And I was just like, perhaps I could get that prick in Nottingham to answer the phone so I can do a gig or something. I suppose you don't know what a long road it can be when you first start out, right. Or some of the hideousness of some of the open mics that you do when you're new. I assume they still exist, of just being used as cannon fodder on a Saturday and you're not being paid. So I think what I learned quite quickly was it's a long road. I suppose I was talking to someone the other day and I said, I'm going to Nottingham. I don't know why I keep saying Nottingham, but I think it was something like Nottingham. And they said, "And how long will it take you to get down there?" And I thought, down, and it's that thing of, I don't think I realised how much I'd have to travel around the country. And I suppose I hadn't realised as a sort of demographic how different audiences would be in different parts of the country. Yeah. And, I think I thought they'd all be like that first gig I did in London with sort of well-meaning lefties. And I remember doing a gig. I was a vegan when I started. Damn, that would be so useful now. But I do think that I remember talking about being a vegan and a feminist quite early on. And when I said I was vegan, this is how long ago it was, the most common heckle was "ha, ha, ha, a Vulcan," which now you'd go, "What?" And I said I was a feminist, and people would be like, oh, do you hate men? And I had this bit about how I didn't say Mrs. or Miss, I said Ms. And I remember doing that around the country, and lots of people afterwards coming up and saying, well, what does Ms mean? I thought it just meant you were single or a bitch or something. I don't know. And I think I was astonished at, oh God, I'm really going to have to find more of a way in with these audiences. I mean, none of these things were awful, but it was just interesting of going, oh my God, you know, James Cook has got this story. I think it's James Cook. He's got a story about how years ago he ran an open mic competition. He ran a competition, I think. I think I've got this right. Apologies to James if I haven't, but only one person turned up. So he said, will you win?
Yeah.
And the guy said, what will I get? And James said, a fame and fortune. And the guy went, but good, yeah, figured. And I think you don't realise how you're going to have to play some terrible rooms and refine your material, all of that. Also, I learned quite early on, if you're going to cough, don't put the microphone. But yeah, it's weird that you asked that, because I'm sure it's one of those things that the minute we get off the recording, I'll say, oh, I know what else was a really big surprise. But I suppose it was surprising to me that, you know, I could gig somewhere and labels would be put on me.
Right.
What people would see, you know, so people would be like, oh, middle class, or oh, Londoner. And those things are incredibly true. But it was weird how that had never occurred to me.
Yeah.
I think I didn't talk about, I still don't feel I really talk. I've got one bit where I talk about sex, but like, you know, I still don't want to do this. But, you know, the difference between men and women seem to go down well. You know, that sort of, I think the lesson I learned at first was be a bit hack, but not too hack.
You talked about their playing venues and up and down the country and abroad.
Yeah.
So do you find that you need to alter your material or your references depending on those audiences that you've been talking about, different places and different crowds?
A bit, not much. Like, I suppose I did a gig quite early on where I'm stupid. I look back now and go, I just didn't know.
Right.
But I was in Leeds and I did a bit about being on the tube in London.
Right.
I mean, I still stand by, if I was a New Yorker and I was talking about the New York tube, they would have gone with it because the reference was just being on a packed train. Yeah. But because I said London tube, you could see they all went, and you expect us to give a shit. I think afterwards the promoter said, you know, don't give a shit about your London tube. And it was like, but it's about being on a packed train. Yeah. So I suppose you try and make it a bit broader. You know, I was aware that to them, they thought it sounded like, don't you all know London? But that wasn't my intention. Yeah. I suppose you do learn, you know, like, I'm an atheist, but I had a bit about having a Jewish family and things that people would say to Jewish people. And I think a lot of people just couldn't relate because they didn't know Jewish people, or I think you do have to make it more accessible. Right. Or I suppose, I mean, I still think you shouldn't change much. But, you know, I remember stupidly, I did a gig in Glasgow and I used to do a lot of stuff. That's right. I used to do a lot of stuff as well about the Pope being a Nazi, because he was a Nazi in those days, different Pope. Yeah. And it probably was edgy. You know, I saw someone had called it edgy in an Edinburgh Review. And it probably is, because I can't quite bring myself to say it now. Well, I probably could. But I did it in Edinburgh at the Fringe and people said it was edgy and I got away with it and people liked it. Right. I did it in America. They were shocked. Like, I only did one open mic in America. They were absolutely gobsmacked. And I did it in Glasgow, and I didn't know enough about the religious divide. And this is what confidence does, though, that I started on my bit about the Pope and Catholics, and someone shouted out, "Do you know where you are?" Because I didn't know what they meant. I said, "Of course I do," and carried on.
Yeah.
And that got a huge roar of laughter because they thought, wow, the confidence, she's really selling this. She doesn't care.
Yeah.
She's not worried that we've said, what the hell are you saying? And the next time I went back, I couldn't do it because someone had said to me, do you realise what you've said there? You've alienated half the audience, whereas because I said it with confidence. So I think you do need to change it a bit, but in a way, I think you shouldn't, if you believe in it, make it so they get the reference, but you should never not say it. You know, I feel a bit like that with Brexit. Not that anyone seems to care about Brexit anymore, but there will be audiences that go, screw you, you elitist London twerp. But if the joke's good enough, you know, I guess there's that thing, you know, and it is what I noticed when I started early doors of some people would say stuff that the crowd loved everything they said.
Yeah.
And that's great. And I'd be like, I have to do that to get booked again. But then I think you also have to go, well, don't be too generic. Or another example of that where I think I did change. I was comparing Bristol jonglers and there was a hen do, and I used to have a bit, I suppose my bit about Mers and are you going to take your husband's name? And there was this hen do that were quite noisy. And I said to her, are you going to take your husband's name? And she went, yes, I am. It's the law. And I said, oh, is it? And then she said, you're not married, are you? I bet no one wants to marry you. and I think now I'd be like, screw you, and do my material and lay into it. But I think at the time I thought, oh, you know, what can I do that you'll like me? And I just went into a bit of being bawdy, you know, like,
right.
I think one of your questions was about persona, and I think I am me. The only thing is, I suppose, because I MC a lot, I think I've become a little bit more, how did you two meet? Ooh, that sounds a bit rude. And in my head, I'm going, really? You know?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I was very much the thing I was about to say is that this idea of the people-pleasing aspect and sort of making everyone to like you, but then the other side of the coin is you're representing your thoughts and ideas and observations.
Yes.
How much of a character are you playing when you're on the stage? That character of you?
Yes, like I think like there was a lovely moment I had. Like I was two things. Sorry, I do apologise at the editing of me being so verbose that may have to go on. I don't think having a third cup of coffee was a good idea. Which is another thing. When I first started, even though I was nervous, I'd have a Red Bull before I went on. What sort of idiot? But like, I remember once at a little packed pub on a Saturday. It was the 99 Club, actually, when they were in a function room above a pub, but it was, I can't remember what it's called, the Wheat Sheaf, and they'd get people in, and they had a massive stag do. And, you know, I was probably being all kind of chatty. I was emceeing, and everyone had done okay. And then the headliner was Paul Foote, and he started talking about Shire horses. And I remember one of the guy who, I guess he would have been the best man, looked at me because I'd already chatted to him, and he went, what's this? And I was like, shh, carry on, you know, carry on listening and everything. And he just was like, what? It just didn't get it and was like shrugging. And a woman shouted at Paul Foote, shut up about Shire horses.
Jesus.
And he stopped for a second. And then he went, and the thing with the Shire horse is that, and he carried on. And by the end of it, I remember he got a standing ovation, and the best man was saying to him, mate, I love you. You're just brilliant. And you know, Paul gave him his card and everything. And there's something about, no, I'm not. I mean, I don't think Paul would go, getting married, no. You know, the ball and chain, and good, and obviously if I'm comparing, I could do that a bit more. But I think there's something so to be said for it. And the other thing, I don't know if this quite illustrates it, but I suppose that thing of, do you say something? I used to have a bit of material, I might resurrect it because I quite like it, about Gardener's Question Time on Radio 4. Mm-hmm. And it's about how, I can't do the whole routine, but essentially it's a woman, there's always a woman on it who says, my name's Margaret. And they go, oh, thank you, Margaret. We don't have much time. And she'll be like, I live in a bungalow. And they'll be like, thank you, Margaret. It's lovely having you. Do you have a question? And she'll go, my maiden name was Forbes. And they'll be like, wonderful. Thank you, Margaret. We're just wondering, do you have I'm so sorry, Margaret, could you do your question? And she'll be like, we have slugs. We don't like the slugs. We don't want the slugs. We want the slugs to go away. And I'd say, Margaret, I know you're saying slugs, but I can't help thinking you really mean immigrants. And that joke, I really, thank you, but I did that joke in Grimsby, I think, and they didn't particularly like me. That joke, they were really applauding, and I thought, oh, good. And then afterwards, I realised they were applauding because they agreed.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no. And then I did it in Brighton, thinking they'd get it, and then someone came up and went, immigrants form a valuable part of our economy and they suffer enough without the racism of people on stage othering them. And I was like, no, I'm the child of an immigrant. No, that's not what I'm saying. And it just really illustrates to me that how you can lose an audience. And I don't do that joke. Actually, why am I telling you that? I suppose because I feel like I like that joke and I believe in it.
Yeah.
But because it just didn't work with either polar opposites. That's not to say all people of Grimsby or all people of Brighton before people write into your podcast. But
if only they would.
Yes. I was about to say that's why. I used to work for a magazine company. It was like a really little magazine company. And it was for kids around the world. And I'd always start the editor letter, thank you for all of your letters. We don't get any letters. But yes, I think you can't, you've got to be you, because otherwise I think and this is sort of what I'm trying to say, I sort of feel about myself is I think I knocked some of the more opinionated edges off.
Right.
Because I feel sometimes when I'm comparing, I don't want to divide the crowd, but actually I think all the comedians I love the most, it's that they are, I hate this phrase, but they're saying something.
There's something that I always call the Al Murray paradox. Is the worry that is that character popular because people see the irony or because they take it at face value, and you're worried about how much of the audience are there because they agree.
Oh, totally. And I think he knew that as well, didn't he? That sometimes he was like, I don't think he'd get it, or Simon Brodkin used to do that Chav character. And there was a time when I can't quite remember what he said, something like, it's pretty brave and subversive. He was in the Chav character. He said something like, Indian people, we don't come to your country and tell you how to run things and inflict our culture on you. And the bloke at the back clapped, and he actually dropped out of character for a second and said, no, I'm joking. And then went back in so quickly, he probably won't even remember that. It is the Al Murray paradox. It's difficult, at the risk of turning the podcast round, this is something that's very much on my mind at the moment, which is in these very troubled times, do you address stuff that's a little bit more edgy and what you think, or do you think I'm just out for a lovely night out? The last thing I want is to be reminded of the crap that's going on in the world. And, I don't know, I guess everyone's got their preferences, but I really admire the people that can do both and make it entertaining without it feeling didactic.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, comedy is basically a communication tool.
Mm.
So if you've got big, grandiose subjects that you want to pontificate on, as long as they make them funny, as long as there's a joke in there,
Yeah.
you can communicate it. It's just the people expect to be made to laugh. So
Yes.
but you can get the point across as long as there's laughter beneath it.
You've got to make it funny, I guess. And that's the thing, because like I really enjoy that. There's a guy who, he doesn't do comedy anymore that much, I don't think, called Liam Malone, who used to do that. Or I love Ian Stone. Yeah. You know, because he manages to be silly with it. So, yeah, I can't remember what your question was. I've just wandered off at a massive tangent, like some woman talking to us.
I mean, we were talking about the character review on stage initially.
Yes. And I think it's there. I like the gigs when I can be more me, which sounds weird, but I guess, you know, there was a lovely gig I did in Northampton where I don't know why, you know, I mean, this is how all gigs should be, but like the minute I went on stage, I felt they were silly. I was silly. The microphone did a massive thing of sort of feeding back, and I pretended that it electrocuted me and killed me. And, you know, and it was just fun. I left that gig thinking that's exactly who I am, because I think sometimes just doing your material, it's great if something else can happen in the room.
Yeah.
So I think you join me at a moment in my head when I do think, because I MC quite a lot and I love that.
Yeah.
But I think there is that about being more me, and not being afraid to do that in case people go, you know, she was miserable, or she was opinionated, or, you know, she's a lefty. And I think you just have to go, well, yeah. You know, I'm always astounded when people aren't really their stage personas, because I'm still that sort of gullible idiot listening to the radio. You know? But yeah, I think I more or less am.
Yeah. Well, how does that switch up then between when you're doing like an hour show, an Edinburgh show, for example, and emceeing or doing spots? Because I would assume that given more time, you know, you can be more yourself, because you can have that time to spend in the conversation, as opposed to having to be gag heavy in a 5, 10,
Absolutely.
15.
Well, I think that, you know, I mean, before I answer this, having said all my lofty ideals, I'm aware that we first met when you saw me doing the show with the guy sat on the sofa there. I was doing a show with my dog who stood up on cue. But I do prefer an hour show. Yeah. I love an hour show, because I think you can say, I think this, on the other hand, I think this, and you can be silly. You can, you know, you can have lots of different components. So I do love that the most, I think. Yeah. And doing spots. I love emceeing because you can piss about with the crowds. And I quite like feeling sometimes like I'm with you, and I like going back to the sort of characters in the room. Yeah. But I think in terms of thinking, I like that joke, or I like saying that, I do love doing hour shows. It's just that, and this brings me to another thing of, I think you said what surprised me about being a comedian. I think Edinburgh, I used to think Edinburgh was this amazing festival that you got invited to and earned a fortune at. I would look at, the first time I went to Edinburgh, and I wasn't a comedian yet, I think I'd done the course, and I looked at the brochure, and there were some people who had like half a page ads. And rather than now knowing that poor person has paid thousands, I would think, wow, what a coup. They've got this person. They must be amazing. And, you know, I suppose just that whole thing of, you know, I love doing Edinburgh. I'm sure I'll do it again sometime, but the awfulness of it as well, in terms of desperate for audience, worrying about reviewers, even though we might have to come to reviewers and what I think about that. Yeah.
Well, what has your Edinburgh experience, your festival experience as a whole been like? Because you've done Edinburgh a number of times. So how has it changed over the years for you?
Yeah. I think as a whole, I've never regretted doing it when I've done it. But I think it's a long month. And I think like the first time I did it, actually the first time I did it was an absolute disaster that I've deleted from history. Just because I knew nothing. I was told that midnight at the Underbelly doing a two-hander with someone that I didn't know very well would be a good idea. And it was a nightmare. And then I did a three-hander that I loved with some friends, and we just messed around, because that way you're not just sharing the bill, you're sharing the, oh my God, who've we got in? And it was just fun. And then I did my first solo show, which I loved, which was about my real life and my fantasy life. And then I think I did other shows that I think I've enjoyed them all, but obviously Edinburgh, it's so dependent sometimes on where your room is, whether audiences have changed over the years and they're less willing to take a punt, or all manner of things. And then I think, my best Edinburghs were with the dog. Because I think this comes to another thing about comedy is people would go, who is Juliet Meyers then? And people would go, oh, she's sort of, she's sort of middle class, she's a bit feminist, ooh, Jewish. And I haven't really got much to say about being Jewish, although actually I did do a show about my Iraqi Jewish roots. But I'm not going to say anything about, I'm Jewish, so therefore I do this. I can't bear it when people attribute their personality to something. I'm going to have to add a massive asterisk to that, because in some cases I can think of how it does affect them. But when I said I'm doing a show with my dog, people go, what's your show about? I had one word, dog. And people came. People like dogs. He upstaged me. And, I notice even now at gigs, sometimes I'll do a little bit of political. I was doing something the other day and I did a bit about Trump, a bit about Farage. And people were like, ha, ha. And then I said, I've got a dog. And they were like, oh, we like you now. Now you're talking with love and affection about your dog and doing impressions of your dog. We like you. So that was my best Edinburgh. And then I think I did, I suppose actually the Edinburgh before I got the dog, and the Edinburgh that I feel is responsible for the dog, is I wrote a show called Through the Pigeonhole, which was about how I didn't like being pigeonholed, and that you shouldn't pigeonhole people. And I wrote it. It was probably a little undercooked. And I had an imaginary child in it called Carlitos, who was just gratuitously rude about the world. But I enjoyed it. But if people don't know you, they take a punt. And I had a reviewer in. This was probably my work. This was an Edinburgh turning point. I had a reviewer in from the Sunday Times or the Times, and I was quite surprised because it was like a little free fringe venue. The room was boiling. He came up the stairs, and there's a character in Spartacus who's I can't think what he's called. He's the slave trader anyway. There's a bit in that where he gets angry and he's like, the sun's over there, and to the slaves, and he expects everyone to greet him. And he came up the stairs and he went, oh, very hot in here. And I said, I've put you next to the fan. And I said, and thank you for coming. And he just glared at me, and I had the worst gig I think I've ever had. But also made worse if I overthink it, or if I feel I'm being judged with different eyes than just audience enjoyment eyes. It was terrible, and exacerbated by the fact it was so hot that a man in the front row was talking rubbish or said something a bit off colour about women, or I'd touch you, or I'd something. So I had to address it. And then he said something like, anyway, I'm too hot. And he took his jumper off in this hot venue. And he wafted it at me, and I nearly fainted from the smell of his beer. And I remember thinking, I'm not doing Edinburgh again, and I'm getting a dog. And so, and, it's weird because I feel like this guy's name is etched on my brain, and I genuinely can't remember it. But occasionally I've seen his name and I think, thank you. You made me hate Edinburgh so much, because the review came out and just said, oh, she's one of Sarah Millican's writers on her TV programme. And she's clearly a writer, not a performer. And the show doesn't really go anywhere. And I thought, thank you, mate. You've given me the reason to walk away from Edinburgh. And I did I didn't, because then I had the dog and the dog made me have the best Edinburghs, really. But, it's, you've been up there, I don't know if you go up for the whole, it's a long month of, you feel invisible, you're desperately trying to get people in. And because I've often done the free fringe, you sometimes get people in with so little commitments, who, the last venue I did, people were coming in and out, and there was a bar at the back. And, there was this one family who they put about 8 2Ps in the bucket. And, you just go, that wouldn't bother me normally, but you go in the middle of doing an Edinburgh where, I'm doing a show that I know works. It just awful. But then, you're with your mates. It's fun. You get better as a comedian.
Yeah.
I'm a comedy fan as well, so I always go and see a lot of shows.
Yeah.
But the bagpipes give me terrible flash. I walked past Selfridges the other day and someone was playing the bagpipes and I had PTSD.
That's it. You said about the venue being free fringe. It's upstairs. It's sweltering hot, and in my head immediately went Counting House.
Yes. Yes. Was.
Wow.
It was.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's a lot in there. So let's talk about. We first of all we should really mention Homer. We should talk about him. So this flipping rescue dog, as you eloquently put it. So you talk about him changing your act, your life. Are you the comedian now as you were pre-dog? Is it the same you now?
I think it is the same me, but it's like I did a show in Buxton with Homer. And the year before that, I'd done a show where I think I was talking about, politics and feminism and stuff. And someone came to the show where I had Homer. And it was the first time I'd actually sold out and I had to put in extra seats. And this guy said, who I think is involved in running it, said, I wouldn't have had you down as a dog owner. And it was a sort of weird thing to say. And I think what he meant was, you're spikier without him. And then when you talk about him, we see a whole other side to you, which I think it's very difficult to see yourself from the outside, but I guess he allowed me to say, I suppose I could be ranty about him, but it was very clear that there was a lot of affection. And also the show, touches on my sort of sadness at not having actually been a parent, or having a dog that I would, it's a bit like, I remember quite early on someone said to me, never talk about your dog as your fur baby. And you go, well, no, I will, screw you. So I think it was always obvious that I was not this uptight militant person, but I suppose, like I was saying when I did this gig recently, the minute I talked about the dog, maybe there was a different texture in my voice, because maybe it wasn't just jokes. There was a lot more admission about this is how I feel about a dog. Maybe it was more autobiographical. Right. I don't know if that sounds wank, but I wonder if that is what the show allowed me to do. It allowed people to like me more. I don't know.
Do you feel like maybe you have a partner?
Yes.
Does it hark back to that, doing a split bill and having that lot of protection of having someone with you on stage kind of thing?
Yes, it really does. I think Edinburgh can be lonely. And I remember the first year I went up with him, the whole thing was a gamble because I didn't know how I'd been on stage with him before, and he'd been very funny at Top Secret, and he'd jumped on stage and then walked up and down the aisle, and schmoozed sat on seats. But I didn't know if he'd do it in Edinburgh. And And he did. But there was also an element of, even if he doesn't, even if this is a disaster, I will have had fun with my dog. And I think maybe that element of fun and a sort of, he's not, I wish I could get him a little bib saying support animal, but I think he sort of was, because like say, it was like being in a double act.
Yeah.
And I knew I had the jokes, but there was something quite funny about going, well, I've got my dog with me, so I can't have a bad day because he makes me laugh. I did a show, I think it was the show where we first met, and the show was called This Flipping Rescue Dog's Ruined My Life.
Yeah.
And a woman quite early on, just when people were coming in, said to me really sweetly, excuse me, you love that dog. Because he was just amusing me and just his prancing around the gig. So yeah, I think at times I feel like I think, but I used to be more strident about world topics, and now I'm talking about my dog. But yeah, I think he has slightly changed me.
Yeah. You mentioned about reviewers.
Yeah.
How do you respond to, I mean, let's generously call it feedback.
Yes.
How do you look at that? How do you deal with it, if at all?
Well, I think while sat in my flat this morning, I'm like, I'm fine with it. I remember bumping into a woman who doesn't do it anymore called Helen Keane, who got a very mediocre review when she was in Edinburgh one year. And she was able to quote verbatim this review. And it was funny because I saw in her what I saw in me, that you go, wow, it's one person's written this and you have absorbed every word. One year I did a show about protesting and Spartacus or something. And I'm desperately trying to think of the pun that this person wrote about me. But it was like, well, you've just put that pun in because it's a pun on Romans or something. Or someone quite early on called me a game old bird. And you go, game old bird. Or, once I did The Stand and someone said, oh, middle-aged, aging vegan. And I remember thinking, wow, I'm actually the second youngest on. And it took me, the reason why I mentioned that, it was one person, it wasn't even a review, it was sort of a blog type thing.
Right.
And I remember being livid about it. And it took me about 5 years until eventually I wrote on his blog and said, interesting, I was the second youngest person on. I wonder why I was picked on. Could it be that you didn't care that Scott Kapura was much older or anything, just pure sexism? And I just thought, because everyone always says you can't say anything, you mustn't say anything, you must just respect it, as if, it's... and actually he then did comedy and got a 1-star review from Steve Bennett. And I was like, ha, 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 ha. And I was like, hang on, this is my thinking being flawed here, because I'm saying reviews mean nothing. And then Steve Bennett has bashed him on my behalf. I think I'm okay with it now. I think it's hard because sometimes you go, but that's not true. That's not how it happened. And sometimes you go, fair enough. Sometimes someone sees something in the show that you go, oh yeah, that is a bit of a crack in the show, or you're right, the ending doesn't live up to that, or so I think I'm okay with it. I think reviews have become slightly less powerful because like in the year that I did the show with Homer, even though it did get lovely reviews from quite a lot of people, most people, but I think it didn't matter because people came anyway. Yeah. But I suppose there is I think I'm fine with it, but obviously there is you're not supposed to reply, and you're just supposed to be happy with what people say about you. And some people know comedy better than others, so I often think I don't know if I should say this, but it doesn't apply to you. I nearly did a character. I didn't go to Edinburgh last year, but I nearly did a character called Paul, the overconfident bloke, and it was going to be him going, No, it's not you. But it was like, no, but it's that thing of how it was. I didn't write it in the end, but it was almost like it was based on someone I'd met who I don't think did review comedy in the end. But he said, oh, I'm going up to Edinburgh because my son's in Edinburgh. And he said, so I might review shows. And I said, oh, right. And he said, yeah, you know. So if you want to know whether you're funny or not, you know. And it was like,
wow.
How, like, just go and watch shows and enjoy shows. Yet the fact that you think you can be the sort of emperor figure going yes or no.
Yeah.
And I think there is that, you know, anyone can be a reviewer now with blogs and stuff. And it's subjective, you know. That's not to say, you know, I'd be lying if I said I didn't care what someone thought. But I think you suddenly go, it's sort of like the first time you die on stage, it's awful. And then the second time you go, well, I might die with more panache. You know, if this ship's going down, I once saw a Dutch guy called Hans Theeuwen have the worst death I think I've ever seen. But he did it with absolute, I can't remember how he did it, but he did it with such joy and fun of nailing his own coffin more and more and more. And there's something about, well, people won't like you or people won't get it, you know, so what does it matter?
Yeah. You said about that you enjoy watching comedy. Do you still watch it the same way as an entertainment, or do you now look at it with a critical comedian's eye?
Yeah. Do you know what? I think sometimes I do just watch it. Sometimes I think I'm beginning, you know, I often start off watching it going, oh, how have you, you know, what are you doing with those beginning bits? You know, are you setting out your stall? Who are you? You know, what are you doing? You're doing crowd work, what are you doing? Like I went to watch Sarah Keyworth recently and they were amazing at taking us all along so well that I think after a while I'd forgotten to try and look at where the bits were sewn or anything. I just found it charming. And so I think I watch, sometimes I watch for entertainment, sometimes I watch out of pure, I watched Ronnie Cheng the other day on Netflix. And I really admire him. And I suppose because of that, I was watching him more carefully.
Right.
I suppose because I really like him. I really wanted to see how he was going to, like, he started off just talking about sort of wanking in a tube because he's trying to get his wife pregnant kind of thing. But then he ended up talking about MAGA. And I watched it and just loved it. And then I went back and watched again and thought, how did you go from that to that? I can't remember how you got from that to that, and changed gear and became actually really quite bitey or having some kick. But I just, you know, I think I do just enjoy watching comedy, you know.
Yeah. You mentioned about having written for Sarah Millican, but you've written extensively for television and radio. And so being a writer, being a performer, writing your own material, writing for other people, emceeing, you said how much you loved emceeing and how much you love doing an hour show. Do you have a comfort zone, a go-to place? Is it writing? Is it performing? Is it doing the spots? Where do you feel happiest, do you think?
I suppose just messing around. You know, I quite like that, you know, I've got a bit of material, but, you know, I love it if something happens and you can just mess around. But I suppose I do love writing. And an absolute shout out to Sarah that probably the bulk of my writing has been for her TV show and her radio show. She writes her own stand-up. But I loved writing for her. I mean, I think I love writing jokes, but I think I quite like just brainstorming jokes and silliness. And then people often say, oh, but then how do you feel about someone else saying the jokes that you've written? And I'm delighted because often they're jokes that wouldn't fit me. Or, you know, in Sarah's case, she'd often say, you know, oh, I've changed that. I love the idea of it, but I've changed it. so she's really involved in the whole process. Like there was one year I think I wrote something about she was doing a TV show about Christmas telly, and I said something about Christmas spoilers, and I said, or Jews as they're called, and she was like, I can't say that. And, which I knew she couldn't, but I quite enjoy the process of if you're writing jokes for people, you can just throw everything down and it's up to them to choose.
Yeah.
And she changed it to children, which obviously is much better. But and fits her persona. But I like it. You know, I really like I love writing. I think, you know, if I had to make a comedy wish, it would be I'd love to get more writing work again because I really enjoyed it. I suppose I always find it terrifying. Like I feel like I'm the world's worst procrastinator. Whereas also I suppose the deadline of someone going, I'm paying you to do this. And if you don't do it, or if you do it badly, you will look an arse. And I'll know you're an arse. I'll never use you again. Focuses my mind. Like, you know, so I suppose I often think, gosh, you know, you've spent all day pissing about to write one joke for yourself. But the minute someone has gone, you better fucking do this, I've gone, oh my God, I thought I had ADHD, but I don't. Now I'm terrified.
Juliet, how can we find out about you and where we can come and see you performing?
That's a very good question. Because I'm terrible about letting people know where I'm performing. I think if you follow me on Blue Sky or Insta, I've just started doing TikTok really badly because I'm new to it. And but if people would like to follow me on TikTok, that'd be great. It's me and Homer, but it's not all me and Homer. It just happens to be all me and Homer at the moment. I haven't got any solo shows coming up, but I hopefully will do. So just follow me on one of the social medias and I'll crow about it somewhere. Sorry, the reason why I'm looking vague is because you haven't asked me a question that I was really looking forward to. But it's terrible. But this just proves how I am so rubbish at the two things. As I was just talking, I was thinking, hey, how can people find me? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. And then I just thought, oh, he hasn't asked me about my worst ever gigs. And I thought, are you desperately trying to talk everyone out of ever liking you? One of the words I'd really like people to apply to me is clever. I never know why. Childish probably, but I always want people to go, oh, you're clever. And I was thinking that the worst ever gig I ever did, someone rang me up and said they'd seen me at a gig in Leicester or something, and they said, we liked your stuff, it was very clever. And so they just hooked me. And I'd done stuff about feminism, and they said, we want to book you for a women's night. And I was like, oh, how wonderful. Is it like is it Rebecca Solnit? Is it feminism in America, you know, kind of thing? And they said, no, it's a women's night, as in it's strippers. And I said, really? You know, I was like, really? I'm not sure. And they said, yeah. And I even said, look, I know quite a few comedians that do quite smutty songs. And they got back to me and they said, no, we want you. And I was so flattered and so up myself. I said, oh, yes, thank you. Yes. Well, no, I agree with you, you know, because they said they'd seen someone and they went, no, we like you better. And I went, well, yes, of course. And essentially, I was put on before these two male strippers that were running late. And even when the strippers turned up and the guy said, look, Juliet is going on before you, one of the strippers said, what do you do? And I said, I do stand up. And he went, won't work. And I'd say, oh, well, you know, I'll just work the crowd. And I was already beginning to think, oh, God. And they went out and they did collars and cuffs.
Yeah.
So they're bare-chested. They were wearing their sort of posh trousers and then bow tie, bare-chested. And they were running late, so the crowd were already baying for blood. Then they went out before me. There was a break, and they fed women marshmallows from a chocolate fountain. And sort of, deep-throated them with these chocolate marshmallows, sort of, so they were like, and everything. And it was...
That's like a choking hazard.
Yes, it is. It is, actually. Then they said, Charles and Daniel or whatever will be back soon. They took them away and said, please welcome Juliet Meyers. And I don't think we ever died so badly. I played to silence, but also just... And again, going back to your thing of being yourself, it wasn't going to work, but also it didn't work being... So I sort of abandoned all... I said to one woman, why are you here? And she said, because I want to see willies. And I said, are you married? And she said, yeah. And I said, does your husband have a willy? And she said, yes. And she said, he's at the back of the room. So there were the husbands were at the back of this room and almost policing their wives. And so I said, oh, do you have a nickname for your husband's penis? And she said, yes. And I thought, good, this will be funny. And I said, what do you call it? And she said, his willy. And I was like, oh, God, it was just the most awful thing with these women going, we won't cock. We won't cock. And eventually, because I'd been booked to do half an hour, I said to one of the husbands at the back, well, let's get one of the husbands up and do a strip. Just his shirt. And I got the most angry, miserable man who did it for a pint, who just took his shirt off and went, can I have my pint now, please?
Wow.
And it was like, God, I've never known such hostility from the women and the men in the room. And eventually I just got off. But the reason why I find this funny is the next day, the guy who'd booked me was driving me to the station and he was much less enthusiastic about me then. And he said, oh yeah, I've got some other gigs coming up. I've got some gigs where people talk about feminism and books. And I said, oh, that sounds good. And he said, no, not really for you. And it's like, oh, thanks. Know your audience, I guess, is moral there.
But what about the flip side? What has been the best experience you've had doing comedy?
Do you know what? This is harder to nail because I think those gigs where you just control the room, there was a few years ago, quite a big comedy room in London. And the minute I went on stage, I just pissed about and you just feel you can control the room and you're spinning plates and you're saying outrageous things. I remember saying stuff that you now go, oh God, do you know what? If someone looked at this carefully, they could go, I beg your pardon, what did you just say to me? But, and I think I've had quite a lot of those nights emceeing in London. But I don't know if I could pinpoint a particular, I suppose recently this lovely gig that I did in, where I said that I got I pretended I'd been electrocuted and was dead. But just that thing where you go, oh my God, I don't want to leave the stage. That thing where you say, I've got to go now. And the audience goes, oh, and you just think, oh, that's lovely. But no one ever wants to hear about your best gigs. It just sounds up yourself.
And so my final question then, the question I ask all of my guests, how would you sum up comedy in a nutshell?
Well, I suppose to me, comedy is, there is that thing of, I love the bonkersness of comedians. I love that sort of sparkiness, vulnerability, stupidity, unreasonableness, but also logic, and freedom. It can be comedy can be amazing, I always feel that open mic, if you can get through the open mic circuit, then the world gets easier. Like when I think of all those awful gigs where like a few years ago, I think post-pandemic, I turned up at quite a few open mic gigs to try new stuff. But the way some of the promoters and some of the audience viewed you, because they thought you were just new, and it meant even my old stuff that gets rounds of applause didn't work.
Right.
So I often think, keep going. Don't let some gigs put you off.
Juliet, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me bang on in the most woolly way, but you've pushed so many, I've got something I could say about that. So it's been an absolute joy.